everyone. My name is Laura Line, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and to our monthly webinar series, Climate Conversations, Pathways to Action. Our conversation today will be recorded and available to view right here after the event. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit them in the Slido box below the video at any time, and we'll incorporate them into the Q&A section of our programming. We also encourage you to participate in the polls that will appear in the same location and to give your feedback after the event in the survey linked above the video. For today's climate conversation, Securing Financing for Responding to Climate Change, I'm excited to introduce my colleague Brent Hurd, who will kick off our discussion. Brent is a Senior Program Officer with the Board on Energy and Environmental Systems here at the National Academies and is co-director on the Roundtable on Macroeconomics and Climate-Related Risks and Opportunities. Over to Brent.
Thank you, Laura. Before diving into the conversation today, I just want to provide a little background on the National Academy's growing portfolio of work at the intersection of finance, economics, and climate. As Laura mentioned, I have the honor of co-directing our Roundtable on Macroeconomics and Climate, a group that has accomplished some really foundational work in connecting researchers and practitioners across these disciplines. One of our speakers today, Justina Gallegos, was an ex officio member of this Roundtable, and the other speaker, Jean-Francois Mercure, co-chaired the planning committee for a workshop this roundtable convened last fall on the macroeconomic implications of decarbonization policies and actions. In addition to this roundtable's work, the National Academies has a chapter in our 2024 Accelerating Decarbonization Report on aligning the financial sector and capital markets with the energy transition, and I hosted a panel at last summer's Climate Crossroads Annual Summit, which was on financial markets, public and private investment decisions, and the energy transition. If you're interested in exploring any of these resources, I'll encourage you to find the links to these, which are on the events page on the National Academy's website. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce the moderator for today's conversation on securing financing for responding to climate change. Kellie Lunney is a senior reporter covering energy and environment policy on Capitol Hill for Bloomberg Government. She's been a reporter in Washington for more than 2 decades and has worked at E&E News, National Journal, Congress Daily, and Government Executive. Lunney is a graduate of Colgate University in New York. With that, Kellie, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Brent, and thanks all for being here. We're here today to talk about climate financing. We know that addressing climate change takes a lot of political capital, but it also requires a lot of financial capital. More extreme weather in the U.S., from hurricanes to wildfires, continues to devastate communities and destroy property, costing lives and billions of dollars every year. The nature of climate financing is wide-ranging because the solutions to this complex problem require it, whether it's public or private investments or national and international financing, or most likely, some combination of all of those things. The money for mitigating and adapting to climate change can come in many forms, including grants, loans, bonds, and carbon taxes, just to name a few. COP30, which will be hosted by Brazil this year, is expected to highlight developing countries' climate finance needs, especially as the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement leaves a leadership vacuum. Climate change is an issue that plays out differently across the globe, but ultimately threatens us all. Efforts to reduce emissions vary widely from country to country, depending on resources and political will, making financing mechanisms and solutions tricky. And as we all know, money and politics go hand in hand. Jean-Francois Mercure and Justina Gallegos, our expert panelists today, are here with us to make sense of it all. We'll talk about the risks of investing in climate mitigation and adaptation, the role of insurance markets, and how climate financing looks in the US, particularly with a new administration and Congress, and in other countries around the world. Thanks to you both for joining us. Would just like to start off at a high level. Well, first I want to introduce our speaker, sorry. Jean-Francois Mercure, goes by JF, is the Associate Professor in Climate Policy at the University of Exeter Business School and Assistant Director of Exeter's Global Systems Institute. Previously, he was a Senior Climate Economist at the World Bank. He is also Principal Economist at Cambridge Econometrics, that is a hard word to say, and Chief Economist at the startup Trex, and he remains a part-time consultant for the World Bank. Justina Gallegos is the former White House Deputy Director of Science and Technology Policy under President Biden, where she led a team focused on industrial policy implementation for clean energy, biomanufacturing, and chips. She previously served as the Senior Climate Finance Advisor for the White House National Economic Council and as a Treasury official with the Obama administration. She also has experience as a venture capital investor. Thanks to you both for being here. Can you both just tell us what brought you into this space, into climate finance, and why we need to think about it, especially now? JF, let's start with you.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks a lot, Kelly. So I'm from the academic side, so I'll sort of be consistent with that. I've been an academic in this area for more than 15 years, and I've been studying this from many angles, everything about climate policy and what should work with climate policy, what helps governments. So I've worked with governments for many years, at the European Commission, UK governments, but other countries like Brazil, different parts of the world. And it always comes to a question of how do we inform better climate policy that is also resilient and helps countries move forwards with their economic development. And I think the climate policy field has gradually moved towards all the issues around climate finance, and especially international climate finance. And we can see this at the COP meetings, the international climate meetings every year, where the discussions revolve around that. So that's sort of how I came into this picture.
Great, Justina?
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here. As mentioned, I had the incredible opportunity to serve most recently in the Biden-Harris White House, leading a team focused on pathways to deep decarbonization and deploying leading edge climate technologies like nuclear or geothermal or low carbon cement, working alongside hundreds of colleagues who were implementing, as you mentioned, a historic industrial strategy that was spread across a suite of legislation. So when you think of the bipartisan infrastructure law or the Chips and Science Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, these were each driving US decarbonization at scale. And so we're coming into this moment on the heels of really an unprecedented season of climate action in the US. And so this is a really important time to be having this conversation about where we've been and where we could go from here. So thank you.
Well, let's start with the basics. What does the financial industry think about climate change? Justina, why don't you start us off? And we can look at it from the mitigation and adaptation perspectives.
Sure. So I won't speak for the financial services industry, but I'll back it up for how we thought about this in government. So I'll propose a really simple schema for how to think about this quite big set of topics that I think we'll get into today. So climate finance can be thought of as a spectrum of economic activities, very simply with climate risk or downside risk assessment and avoidance on one end. And then on the other end of that spectrum, think of upside decarbonization opportunities. So solutions to draw down that risk and provide actual economic upside growth on the other end. So first, let's talk about the downside risks. You can think about this from a really small scale. So think of microeconomic losses from climate change at the individual level. So think of really unfortunate circumstances like you losing your house and the cost of starting over after a devastating fire in California or flood from a hurricane in the Southeast. And these risks can level all the way up to the global macroeconomic scale, so much so that in 2021, the US Treasury Department, along with financial regulators across the US, declared climate change as an emerging systemic microeconomic risk. And that designation is really important. And so climate change could be a risk to the global financial system, which requires ongoing active risk assessment and management to address those risks. And so it's really not hard to scenario out how repeated regional disasters could impact local insurance markets and municipal markets, rolling up all the way to the state, national, and potentially global economic level. And there's a bunch of ways to measure the costs of climate risk. And I'll just throw out a few sizing examples, and we can get more into these if folks are interested. But NOAA has a $1 billion disaster tracker that tracks every storm that is over $1 billion, and there are hundreds of them recorded there. The team at Energy Innovation, a think tank, released a few years ago the cost of delayed mitigation action, amounting to the trillions in lost economic activity if we don't actually start addressing those risks. And Her Majesty's Treasury released a report led by a team called the Stern Team, which put the cost of unabated climate change as high as 20% of GDP. So there's a bunch of ways to think about these really big downside risks. But on the other side of the spectrum, you can think of huge decarbonization market opportunity. And so climate change has been described by many economic leaders as the greatest economic transformation opportunity in human history. There might be a lot of ways to caveat that, but we can think of an unprecedented season of change that is already underway. And there's so much opportunity to create new value in global markets, so much so that Secretary Yellen conservatively priced this opportunity at least $3 trillion every single year through 2050
Wow.
across global markets, that's just a huge amount of market opportunity across a really wide range of clean energy sectors. We track over 35 plus clean energy sectors that are emerging or already really underway, many of which are poised to grow even further at scale and capture that, again, conservative, at least 3 trillion per year global market opportunity. And so when we think about the risks, there's a bunch of tools that are rapidly evolving to measure and scenario plan those tools at every level. And then when we think about the upside opportunity and decarb side, we can get certainly into this more, but there's an unprecedented suite of tools from our administration to deploy clean energy at scale. And so when you think about the more than 24 new or modified tax incentives and credits across tens of programs, hundreds of billions of dollars in loan programs to unleash US clean energy technology and really supercharge that transition. These investments were designed to unlock transformative change that can build a low carbon energy system with American made technology. And when we look at the initial indicia of that upside opportunity, you can already see a really strong curve beginning to grow. And so in the past 4 years, we've seen over, and again, this is a conservative estimate, at least $1 trillion in new private sector investment in critical sectors in the US that we were tracking, which was dominated by clean energy, really spurred by these public sector investments. And when you look across the grid in the US, over 95%, so almost nearly everything new that's being built in the US from power generation is clean. And when we look to the future, we can get more into this current market dynamics. There's a huge current projected uptick in electricity demand from manufacturing and factories and data centers. So there's an immense decarbonization opportunity ahead. So we have huge downside risks to assess and manage, and then upside decarbonization opportunity to build into. So I'll pause there. Thanks, Kellie.
Yeah, I mean, that was a great summation of sort of the landscape. And, we'll get more into the US situation and how the new administration is going to approach clean energy and how that could potentially affect how the private sector responds. But JF, if you could give us sort of an international flavor for climate financing and what other countries are looking at and some of the challenges and opportunities that exist for them.
Okay, well, thanks, Kelly, and good overview, Justina. I would say because, and I'll draw from my experience at the World Bank, dealing with all countries except the US and Europe and the advanced economies, where the challenges are there. So I think that there's maybe a misconception sometimes thinking that, say, developing countries need money or it's expensive or they don't have money. And I think that that's not quite the right way to think about this. Climate finance, international climate finance, is much more about liquidity, and it's much more about, it's not so much transferring money to poor countries, but it's much more about countries' ability to capital formation. Of course, the US has the international reserve currency, so there's never really an issue with that. And say places like the UK have a huge financial sector, so there's no liquidity problem in those places. But when you look at other countries, for example, in Latin America or Africa or parts of Asia, then it's not the same story at all. So what tends to happen there is that the ability of a country to engage in a low carbon transition, for instance, will be its ability to import technology, which often comes from abroad, and that requires to have foreign currency. and that requires to have income in foreign currency. Now, these issues become quite complex, but inevitably there will be an issue that will relate to their existing stock of debts, foreign debt, that is, which they need to service. And in addition, they would need to either borrow more or find sources of foreign currency to invest in those technologies. If they can't, then however profitable these opportunities may be in their countries, they may just not be able to do it. And often their stock of energy is very expensive. It could be just burning oil for producing electricity, for instance. That's pretty much the most expensive way one could produce electricity. So solar energy would be a massive cost saving, but they can't do it because they just can't access the finance to do it. So international climate finance aims to address these issues to spread essentially the transition as well as adaptation right across the world. And I think maybe one way to look at it is that when an investor wants to invest in, say, a Latin American country, they will face what we call currency risk, which is they invest US dollars and the return on their investment is in the foreign currency, the domestic currency of the country where they're investing. And the problem with that is that if the exchange rate changes, then it's possible that their project becomes unprofitable. And that is difficult to address there needs to be a hedge of some kind to address these issues. And that doesn't currently exist. And so that then completely hinder the ability of investors to invest in countries other than the advanced economies, Europe and in the US. And then the same issue happens with adaptation, and we've got countries like in the Caribbean that are crying out for more finance to address their issues of adaptation. They don't contribute emissions at all to the climate change problem, but they need quite a bit of finance to address the impacts of climate on their economies, and that again is not resolved. A lot of the climate negotiations revolve around this, and it's unresolved up to now. I guess that's my summary of international climate finance, and we can return to this.
I mean, it's obviously an incredibly complicated system that depends on a lot of things, as you said, other than just actual money. And it would seem that a lot of risk is involved, which is maybe why many of these solutions are eluding us. How can we leverage the capital to make adaptive investments? In other words, to get to benefits of adaptation, which seem to not produce as much revenue as maybe the mitigation side would. Justina, let's start with you on that one.
Sure. When we think of sort of mitigation and adaptation, I just want to go back to this schema of downside risk and upside deployment opportunity. And I think when we think about mitigation and adaptation, the adaptation side can really be thought of as closer to the downside risk portion. And who is paying for that downside risk? That's often the public sector or state and local governments. Whereas on the upside deployment capital side, that could be certainly the private sector that's spurring the public sector spurring private sector action, which was certainly the approach that the US most recently took with our green energy industrial strategy. But you can think of, I quite simply think of the clean energy transition as a series of assets or building things. And so if you think of building all of the things we need to adapt, who is going to pay for those items? That will probably be the public sector or individuals trying to harden their own landscape. So think of after a fire, rebuilding your home with different types of materials, or proactive planning in a community with fire breaks in between areas. Whereas in the asset building area of decarbonization, there's, of course, much more upside to be gained. And so think of grid scale battery storage or AP1000s coming online from big nuclear plants. And so there's just a different both financial trajectory for those and also who is paying and who is building those assets across that schema. So I'll pause there.
I want to remind everybody to drop their questions into the Slido box underneath the video screen. If you have questions, we'll be doing that towards the end of the webinar. JF, I want to go back and talk about, since your expertise is with the World Bank and other countries, what central banks sort of need to do to get involved in assessing these risks, particularly right now, and does that role evolve based on, you know, just sort of the political and economic landscapes across the globe?
Yes, thanks for this. So I've followed this story quite closely for the last 10, 15 years, and it's been quite interesting where I'd say a decade ago or more, central banks wouldn't go anywhere near this. They would say that's an environmental problem. That's not within the remits of a central bank. It's only since I would say there was a kind of landmark change in the UK with the Bank of England, and then there was a speech by the then Chancellor Mark Carney about how climate change could become a source of systemic risk for the financial system and could essentially threaten pretty much all kinds of financial assets. And that then became a big discussion as to how much, how big, and central banks then started to need to get involved because although it's an environmental problem, it becomes a problem of price stability, and the main job of a central bank is to manage price stability. So from then on, central banks increasingly got involved in this topic. So that became quite interesting. Some of the work that's been done to try to help central banks, I mean, we were early in the game, I suppose, to try to inform this were issues around risks that come from either the climate impact side, so that is, for example, floods affecting houses that then could devalue, and then there could be credit risk. That could be businesses being damaged, and then insurance claims that could cause risks in the financial system. But it could also be on the decarbonization side, where we have assets that are currently valuable, but we are changing regulations and technology is changing as well, and that could cause risk to those assets. I mean, the best example, I think, is to think about the current pace at which electric vehicles are diffusing and being bought and entering the market in places like China and Europe. And that's eating their way gradually into oil demand. And because transport controls an absolutely astronomical amount of oil, it's about 60% of oil goes into transport. So when transport becomes electric, then there's all this oil that is sort of superfluous or in excess. And then we wonder what happens to the global oils markets, and what happens to the sort of less competitive parts of oil production, and could that devalue, and could that have systemic implications for the global financial system? So these are questions that then central banks became very involved in, I would say.
Thank you for that. Going back to the adaptation mitigation discussion, and Justina, you seem to have focused a lot on that. I'm curious if there is more, maybe interest is the wrong word, but more momentum from entities who want to get into the climate financing world for the mitigation side versus adaptation. Is it harder to get adaptation into the equation? And also, after Justina tackles that, maybe JF, you can talk about give us some examples of countries that maybe need more adaptation versus mitigation, or vice versa. Justina?
Sure, thanks, Kelly. So I think when we think about adaptation, so managing those downside risks versus mitigation, capturing those upside risks, the time scale, the time horizon of both that loss and those gains that JF mentioned and that Carney speech, which I encourage everyone to read, really comes into play. And so I think there's objectively more financing going into mitigation solutions, but and much more to do on adaptation. But I think that has to do with that time frame. And so when you look out into the future, I think it's natural to want to maximize upside gains, whereas projecting that loss and having certainty around that loss and then investing to hedge against that loss when you may not feel exactly certain about it can seem quite expensive. And so that requires an immense amount of planning, particularly at the public and community level, and that type of prospective spending for projected future loss is, I think, much less appetizing to folks at probably every level than investing in upside future gains. And so I think circling back to that, again, great speech Jeff mentioned, those time horizons for both loss and gain across that spectrum, I think have a lot to do with the disparate spending in the mitigation and adaptation landscapes.
Does that sort of bolster the argument that perhaps the public sector needs to be more involved in adaptation?
I think the adaptation spending is predominantly currently led by the public sector and probably will for the future be led by the public sector. But the public sector's ability from communities at every scale to really garner the will from your local council people to your state elected officials to your national officials to proactively spend against future risk can seem like a big ask when you're looking at so many other ways to spend precious dollars. But also when you look at the mitigation versus adaptation landscape, the spending for upside gain in the future is a lot more appetizing. And so that's a huge responsibility for leaders in the public sector at every level to really focus on, and that time horizon for loss and that responsibility for prudential financial management of those assets, I think requires a lot of responsible planning at every level.
Yeah. And JF, if you could sort of walk us through a few examples of what the adaptation mitigation landscapes look like in countries that you have studied.
Yeah, okay, so that we have to be clear that climate impacts are happening already. We see them. I think everybody's aware now with the fires and different floods in different parts of the world. Even if we spend a lot of money on mitigation, that's not going to stop, not immediately for sure, maybe never. And so countries have to do both adaptation and mitigation. In the adaptation space, I think the way maybe to think about it, there's maybe, I talk a lot to climatologists here in Exeter. There's two types of effects. There's the sort of everyday sort of heat waves or everyday sort of a change of temperature that makes it difficult to work or change in weather. But there's the kind of occasional disaster that happens. You can never tell when it's going to come. But what we see is that what used to be 100-year flood becomes a 50-year, once in every 50-year flood. That's very different. And then what then happens is that you've got countries, for instance, mountainous countries, say at the foot of the Himalayas, that will have occasionally these absolutely enormous floods that will wipe out enormous value of the economy. And I think of the Pakistan floods just a few years back. Huge event there, and the spend on an event like that is so large. It's a very large part of the entire government budget.
Yeah.
And so those countries have got to typically borrow to address this. And so then they end up in this in a kind of cycle of debt sustainability problems where they borrow to address these issues, but then they've got interest on their foreign loans, and they eventually face a problem of potential bankruptcy where they have to go to the IMF and say we need rescue. And so what the investment in adaptation does is reduce what I will call the tail risk, which is the risk of these destructive events. What used to be a real destructive event becomes a manageable event.
Right.
What that does with a government is that effectively it makes the whole budget much more predictable. You know much more what's in the budgets because you are able to manage those events, whereas when you can't manage them, you just don't know year on year how much money you've got in the budget. And if you're a Caribbean country, for instance, you know very well that the hurricanes are going to hit you fairly often, and with adaptation measures, then you could fare much better in terms of budget and in terms of debts than if you don't have. The problem is that in the financial sector, we have a short-term view, and that's really Mark Carney's kind of main message in his speech, I think, which was called The Tragedy of the Horizon, which is that it says that the problem with climate change is that the impacts happen in the relatively long term, and the financial system thinks in a much shorter term. And so we don't tend to price these risks in our calculations because they're too long term. But ultimately, when you have complete destruction in a country, you're no better off. So you should have done something. Of course, you could say you should be insured, but the best insurance policy, I think, is to reduce tail risk, not to have a claim on your insurance, especially that if it's so large, insurance might itself fail.
Well, and that brings us to insurance, which is kind of the elephant in the room with all of these disasters. Let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, we're obviously with the wildfire situation in Southern California right now, insurance is back in the spotlight. And this has been an ongoing, debate over the role of insurance with increased flooding and hurricanes in the US. Can both of you sort of give us a flavor of how insurance considerations play into climate financing and how the changing role of insurance in the US, for maybe Justina can tackle the US, and then JF, you can look at international, how that plays into climate financing. Justina?
Sure. So I think when we think about measuring that risk, climate change is not a surprise to any insurer or reinsurer around the world. And so they know quite acutely and have really advanced models that are continuing to evolve of where and how to measure that risk at quite a granular level. And so when we think of the future and where climate hazards will happen or are projected to happen in the US, you can imagine potential risk spreading from a local level up to potentially a regional level. And so it's really unfortunate, but think of the activities happening in California and the insurance market that was already strained there from the projected risk and how that could cascade, which is where that prospective planning in the rebuilding of somewhere like LA will really come into play for how that community decides to rebuild in a way that is hopefully more resilient and takes those adaptation principles and applies them in a way that is insurable or is able to evolve in a way that meets the requirements of the community, but also adapts to sort of evolving risk levels. Are you okay with your home washing away and being uninsured? And is that a risk you personally are willing to take if you aren't able to get home insurance? And so I think both those risk appetites at the microeconomic level, all the way up through probably the regional or national level, are going to continue to adapt in real time.
Yeah. JF, do you want to speak to that from the international perspective?
Yeah, well, I'll be a bit crude here, and I'll say that outside the advanced economies, that's the US, say, Europe, Japan, the world's not insured. Most of the world's not insured. And so, in fact, your best insurance is the state, is being rescued by the government when there's a big flood or there's a big event. And it's down to the capacity of the state to do that. And then it's down to international climate finance at the state level. And so that we're back to that question, I think.
Yeah.
So insurance doesn't really work in many places in Latin America or in Africa or in Southeast Asia. And that's where it's a different mechanism. And of course, I think your best insurance policy is always adaptation to reduce the risk of destruction via building, say whether it's dikes or just also all sorts of measures to contain the events, and that requires a lot of finance.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And I think one that we sometimes lose sight of here in the US, for sure. I want to move on to talk a little bit about how the new administration and the new Congress is going to approach this issue and just clean energy in general and the role of fossil fuels. We've obviously seen a lot of executive orders from President Trump on energy, energy dominance. He wants to increase domestic production of fossil fuels, pulling back on a lot of clean energy initiatives that the Biden administration had put forward and invested in. Given what we know so far of what President Trump wants to do and what we've heard from congressional Republicans, now Republicans both, they control the House and the Senate. Reconciliation is going to be something that they're going to look to do some energy stuff in. What does that mean for the private sector in terms of climate financing? And does that mean that, they're going to have to step it up? Does it mean that they're going to pull back because they don't have the security of an administration that's going to invest in it and help sort of grease the wheels? Justina, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. So I can't speak to what the incoming administration will do or from their perspective, but I can share where we handed off the baton and sort of the market dynamics that are currently at play. So we handed off our administration with an unprecedented season of American energy dominance across both certainly traditional energy sources, but also clean sources. And those 35 plus clean energy sectors, there's a bunch of reports called the liftoff reports of the Department of Energy, which track how all of those sectors are increasing in scale at a really rapid clip. And so when you think of huge industrial projects that the US has undertaken in the past, think of the Hoover Dam, these huge industrial projects. In the past few years alone, we have done at least 100 Hoover-sized dam projects in the US. And there's many more smaller projects that have come online in just the past few years. And so there's an immense amount of clean energy activity underway. And as mentioned, over 95% of everything built last year coming onto the grid in the US was clean. And so there's just an immense trajectory for all of these clean energy sectors to continue taking off and continue being financed predominantly by the private sector. And so all of those trends are looking up. That being said, there's also, as I alluded to previously, incredible energy demand, an uptick in demand projected in the next 10 years. There's a 15 to 20% increase in electricity demand projected by the Department of Energy in the next decade, and a doubling of electricity demand projected by 2050. That is a huge amount of new electricity demand. And we really need to think critically about how we're going to meet that demand. And when you look at just the past few years, the uptick across those 35 sectors to meet that demand with new emerging and really established US technologies that other countries want to commercialize, but the US developed and is commercializing at pace and scale. That's really the United States opportunity to win in those markets. And so I think leaders at the national level have really a decision to make about what level of energy dominance they want to continue and what shape they want that trajectory to take. And I think if we want to continue that to meet that demand, there are clean sources across the entire spectrum of technologies to meet that demand. And so we're in a really strong place as far as energy security, but also when you look to the future, there are incredible tools and capacity for America to meet that demand cleanly. And so the future is out of our hands from a government perspective and with the new administration, but You can see all of those tools, capacities, and the demand all there. And so all the elements to meet the future in a really clean way while building economic growth for the US and for global markets is all there. So all the tools and all the pieces are there. I'll pause there.
JF, you mentioned this, and this sort of piggybacks on what Justina was saying. You mentioned this earlier about this notion of stranded assets and risk to fossil fuel producers, given the world's kind of increasing transition to decarbonization. And we're getting into a place, whether it's the US or other countries, where we're deploying capital for green technology, but also fossil fuel technology. Does that create volatility in fossil fuel markets? What does that look like? Is that, if we're investing in both of these areas at the same time, does it sort of upset the balance, as it were?
Well, that's it's hard to have a definite answer to this because, of course, the world is quite complicated right now, as you're well aware, and we've got conflicts, and conflict is not independent from oil-related activities. But and indeed, in Europe, that's been quite drastic.
Right.
But I would say, indeed, that's my belief. I don't know. Will the future will tell how true this is. I think this is correct. That climate action is already, I would say, but inevitably bound to disrupt oil markets and gas markets, and that's going to cause volatility. So what we could have is an alternation between excess supply and lack of supply. We've seen this with COVID. I think it was quite clear. So during COVID, the oil price was negative one day at some points, and it was very low and fluctuating. In fact, since 2015, we've had a fluctuating oil price, I would say, 2014. And right after COVID, it just shot up, and then there was conflicts, and then a cost of living crisis in many parts of the world. Inflation ensued, and so I think this is volatility that's coming into the system. I think could come even more into the system, and that then gives good reason to start rethinking investments because it's very volatile. Of course, we know renewable investments are less volatile. That's very well known, and so there's that tension now, I think, where there's new risks coming into fossil fuels and less risk on the renewable side, but renewables are not as high risk, high return as investments. So there's a difference there. But I would say risk is undervalued on the fossil side. And that's precisely because, and I'll give an example. So I'll take Canada, which I know very well. Midwest Canada has tar sands, and that is somewhat marginal in the global oil market because it's relatively expensive to extract. So when oil prices are too low, these companies could essentially go bankrupt or have difficulties or have mounting debts. And in a volatile oil market, then they could have real difficulties. That could mean that for Canada, that becomes a real difficulty because a lot of income comes from the oil sector, and it would be perhaps helpful for parts of Canada to begin to diversify away from oil in case the transition happens really quickly. And it could happen quickly because we can see change happening in some parts of the world. I would say China and the EU are probably, Northern Europe, I would say, are most notable for the number of electric vehicles and the amounts of renewables in Germany, in the UK, and in the Netherlands. And the pace, and China is the leader. So at the pace at which things are changing in those countries could really, via global energy markets, cause trouble in different parts of the world that are very fossil dependent. So I think this is a time now to start rethinking risk in fossil markets.
That's a very, I think it's sort of a counter to conventional wisdom right now on this topic. So thank you for kind of diving deep into that. I want to stop right now, pause, and go into audience questions. So I'll take a look at what we got here, and I'll try to assign one of you these questions, but if you want to jump in, please, obviously feel free. How how are less conventional financiers like venture capitalists and philanthropists engaging in the climate space? This might be good for Justina, given your background as a venture capitalist.
Sure. Sure. So I think there's room for every type of capital in the capital stack, in the clean energy capital stack. But when I think we think about the clean energy transition and the huge risks that we just talked about that are facing communities and businesses and families across the world, the scale and the time frame to implement that scale really matters. And so if we go back to that frame of building a lot of stuff in the clean energy transition, that stuff costs a lot of money. And so we're talking about $1 billion development projects and huge infrastructure projects and Hoover-sized dam type projects where probably large asset classes are playing. And so you're thinking a lot and more credit and public debt sectors than equity, just because of both the risk time frame, but also the size of a venture fund probably isn't going to be matched to building a $250 billion energy project. That being said, when you look across the full portfolio of clean energy technologies, there's about 35 plus technologies that we're tracking. There are many that are not ready for full scale deployment. And so if you go further down that technology readiness scale, there's a lot of places for smaller fund sizes to play and also take more risk in some of those emerging sectors. And then philanthropy, I think, can and continue to be very helpful in creating really novel blended finance models, but also taking a lot of risk on demonstration projects and a lot of those financing that needs to get further along the scalability spectrum. So room for everyone, but we're looking for probably really big dollars in the
right.
transition.
JF, I don't know if you wanted to speak to that or not. No pressure to do so, but wanted to give you the opportunity.
Yeah, just saying same message, which is venture capitalists tend to invest in the earlier stages of technology creation and innovation, and so that's where they can make a big difference.
What would the role be of carbon taxes? I mean, we've seen some of this in the EU, the UK. Are they not yet in the US, but are they in order? And if so, what would the consequences be of such taxes? JF, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, so the EU ETS exists since 2005. There's good experience with it. It's been a challenge because for a long time it was criticized for the price being too low. What has interestingly led to the rollout of the key renewables in Europe wasn't the carbon tax or the carbon markets. It was other types of mechanisms. They were the feed-in tariff for solar and wind in Germany, and what's called the contract for difference for offshore wind in the North Sea in the UK. The contract for difference, it pays a difference versus the price of electricity for a project. So it just simply reduces investment risk, even if returns not necessarily that high. It reduces investment risk so much that it becomes very attractive to certain types of investors. So it's been very successful, and it brought down the cost of the technology so much that now it competes with fossil fuels. It's cheaper than coal. What the carbon tax has been good for in the UK, unambiguously, was it killed coal. It killed coal electricity. But that could only happen because we had offshore wind and other renewables being scaled up at the same time. So you have to understand that the contract for difference mechanism was working hand in hand with the carbon market allied with the carbon price floor to sort of push some fossil fuels out of the electricity market. That said, that doesn't affect the oil market because that's cars and it's different. So I think the carbon tax is not the one thing that solves all the problem as maybe it might have been thought of in earlier years. I think it has to work hand in hand with other instruments to get to something. And in mainland Europe, I think the EU ETS has done some useful signals to investors. But if you look at what's happening in the recent years, because there's been a shortage of gas because of the situation with Ukraine, then the gas plants, well, the electricity had to turn back to coal, and that led to a shortage of essentially allowances in the market. So the price of carbon went up
Hmm.
because there was a shortage of, well, because there was a shortage of natural gas, which is the ETS working in reverse, if you like. Instead of the transition driving the price, it's the global energy system driving the price. So I think then there's questions being raised about, how should it work? Well, I don't know if that's very controversial. Not everybody agrees with this, but what's definitely uncontroversial is to say that the feed-in tariff and the contracts for difference were the cause of the great progress we've made with the renewables in electricity.
Justina, I don't know if you want to speak to the possibilities of carbon pricing, carbon taxes here in the US at some point. I know that that's been talked about in Congress for a while, but it's still a pretty contentious issue.
Sure. Well, I'll just take a quick step back. And when we think about the clean energy transition and needing to actually transition from one set of assets to a new set of assets. And so we're stopping building a bunch of stuff very simply, and we're starting building a bunch of new stuff. When you think of that clean energy industrial strategy and really the strategy part of that, the approach that we took in the Biden-Harris administration was to proactively build the future assets right now versus just stopping the current assets. So if you're thinking about that transition and that wind down, you have to have somewhere to go. And so the order of operations, I think, really matters here. And so that's where the proactive public sector investment, that's where private sector investment in building those decarbonization solutions out, I think is really important before you stop the economic activity that you're trying to deter. So if I just theoretically unplugged all gas stations somehow and stopped drilling, but didn't have any alternative to go to, how would I get to work? How would we turn the lights on if we didn't have those alternatives built out? And so there has been proposed by many a period in this transition where you'll be concurrently building two energy solutions, where you're starting new and continuing with the old, but then the old winds down, which is where most of the models go. And so we're in that concurrent building season. But before you start probably pretty actively taxing the activities that you want to stop, you'd want to have a pretty hefty build of the proactive solutions that you're transitioning to, which is a little bit of the theory there, but which is to say, we invested in decarbonization solutions before we moved to a potential carbon tax, but you would always probably want to have the alternative solutions en route before you started taxing what is currently you're trying to avoid.
Hard to be flying the airplane while you're building it, which is what it sometimes feels like with this. What is the role of the Fed in this? And I think when the questioner says in this, I think they mean climate financing. And how is that different from many central banks that have started factoring in climate risk? JF, why don't you start us off there?
Yeah, so in order to avoid changing the mandates of a central bank, which is to maintain price stability, the primary interest or the primary mandate of a bank in terms of climate is to look at risk to first order. Now, there's been lots of proposals for central banks to get involved in sort of differential rates for green versus brown activities. I don't know what my opinion is on this, but I think it's quite difficult to change the mandate of a whole institution. So if we stick to that, they've already got plenty of work to do, which is to assess risks from the physical side of climate, that's climate events, disasters, and the transition side of the transition. So that's risks, for instance, with fossil fuels or all the possible stranded assets, or how quickly the economy is transforming itself. There's all sorts of risks that appear that come from there. Central banks are there in the end to keep order in this whole thing, right? And so I think there's plenty of work there to do for banks, and there's lots of development in their thinking that still needs to be done. Although I think enormous progress has been made in the last 5 years, 10 years, um, and that needs to continue. Some of that needs to become more and more looking in horizon scanning, looking into the future. Where are we going? And perhaps because of the tragedy of the horizon, that is investors looking too short term, while climate is a long term problem, then central banks have got a clear role in addressing this and looking into the far future to see where we're going and what are the risks going to be. Some of it is reporting, some of it is disclosure and setting new standards around that so that investors are clear what risks they're facing when they are investing in different classes of assets in different companies. They need to know what they're getting. And so setting those standards is also very important.
Justina, would you like to weigh in on this?
Sure, just very quickly from the US perspective, you saw in the last 4 years the beginnings of just exactly that activity that JF mentioned from US economic regulators led by the Financial Stability Oversight Council, or the FSOC, which started undertaking climate-related financial risk assessments across the entire US and global system, and beginning to put in place tools to refine that ability to assess that risk and the vectors of volatility that could come from physical and transition risk posed by climate change. But certainly a lot more work to do on that front to refine those scenarios and understand where those vectors could come from and cause potential systemic volatility and risk. But the fact that that risk is on the radar and publicly identified in their open statements as a matter that they are undertaking, I think is something that we can all be heartened by, but certainly we'll watch that space for continued evolution in that risk assessment and then management.
Thank you. We're getting a lot of questions related to adaptation. So let's start with Justina again on this. Could you comment on the challenges of having meaningful metrics on adaptation? And are dollars going towards adaptation, or lack thereof, among the best indicators of meaningful actions that lead to real resilience?
Sure. So I think there's a really robust discussion happening right now in the resilience and adaptation community on how we measure outcomes or ROI of impact of dollars spent. But when you think about that sort of loss avoidance in planning perspective, you certainly want to increase seawalls in places where you know there are obvious flooding risks. You want hardened spaces in areas where you know you are prone to wildfires. And so there's an immense amount of activity that is necessary, but I think it again comes down to those time horizons and your risk appetite for addressing those now versus later. And that's where I think risk appetites and unfortunate realities of physical hazards that I think will continue, we will know will continue to happen across communities, I think will potentially change those risk appetites. And so I think that's a really live discussion happening right now, but a lot more to do in sort of proving out the ROI of adaptation, even though we all here certainly know that that's necessary, but hard to actually spend that dollar.
Right. Takes some faith and imagination. JF, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, well, quickly, I suppose I think adaptation is your insurance policy, and it reduces tail risk, which is something that's not very well measured and reported, I suppose, because ultimately measuring rare events is itself challenging. But there are methods I think there needs to be a lot of development in that area to have a better understanding of precisely. So what people want to know is how much money do you save when you invest in adaptation? And that's a number that's difficult to estimate because you need to know how often these rare events happen and how more frequent they are becoming. And because we don't know this, then it's difficult to value the money spent on adaptation and then nobody does it. I think that's where we are, right? So what we need to do is have better methods to estimate that. And what I've seen is useful, but could really see lots of improvements. For instance, at the World Bank, we could really improve how we're doing this assessment, especially for really risk-prone areas around mountains or low-lying islands, for instance. But also in places like the US, obviously, and of course the insurance industry is on that case, but potentially academia could provide better methods that could be used more widely.
Mm. We have a financing and technologies question. How does the financing and technologies that are quote unquote successful, such as in clean energy, change from the early, I think they mean the early sort of seed stage and throughout the funding phase to the investment bank stage? Justina, do you want to start off on that?
Sure. Yeah, so just very simply, I think we touched on this a little bit, but I think this really just has to do with scale. And so at earlier stages, you're talking smaller dollar demonstration projects or tests or pilots of a facility to see if it actually works, and then show both communities and your investors that you can repeat at scale that effort that you're doing in the clean energy space, versus really established technologies. You're thinking of business model innovation to even further penetrate markets and help make the affordability even more accessible to consumers at every scale. And so the financing will be quite different for later stage technologies than those early stage test technologies. And that will probably have to do also with size check in a pretty corollary fashion.
JF, is that anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just give an example. I think the rate of cost reduction of technologies is really critical, and you can't know this in advance. So the example I'm giving is again offshore wind in the North Sea, because it's a sort of famous example, I suppose, where the cost used to be, I think, around 200 pounds per megawatt hour. That's what $250 per megawatt hour, and it came down to something like 40. Now, the rate of cost reduction, the learning rate, was very, very high. And that only happened because there was cumulative investment into this, and there was a really deep belief in government that they could achieve this, but there was no guarantee that the rate of cost reduction was going to be so rapid. So obviously, it was a very risky investment to make for any investor. And of course, the government knew this, and so sort of formulated a policy mechanism to address that. But it is still risky. And the point is that you want that trajectory of cost reduction to lead to a place where it has a chance of becoming the new normal. I mean, you can't just get stuck at twice the price of fossil fuels. You've got to beat fossil fuels in the end with those technologies if you're really in the market going to go big. And the banks are only going to come in when it's already there, when it's already ready to scale up and it's already competitive. So earlier stage, you need different kinds of investors who are willing to take that risk. And it's a range of different people, and the government has a big role to play in trying to induce this. And that's true in every technology. It's happening in batteries for vehicles where we're very successful. Solar energy has gone down a staggering amount in cost. And then we're seeing this in newer technologies like around hydrogen production, green hydrogen, that is. And then we'll see this in new technologies like green steel using green hydrogen, for instance, where the cost is still high, but they could come down with the right amount of investment. But we're never completely sure that it's going to make it to become competitive.
This is a somewhat related question, I think, to this discussion. Are there opportunities for funders to purchase new technologies while receiving set rates of returns to pay off the installations? For example, some US local governments fund home solar, the homeowner pays back the cost over a long time horizon, et cetera. I think the question is basically getting at, are there incentives for clean energy at the funder level, but also at the homeowner consumer level.
Sure.
Justina?
Sure. And without belaboring this point, and I hope we can send this around after, there's entire suites of information from the Inflation Reduction Act in particular that have entire suites of tools for consumers and producers of clean energy, from credits in the form of investment tax credits or production tax credits to vehicle purchase credits, to a bunch of incentives for consumers for upgrading your home that are now being rolled out at the state level. There's grants for demonstration projects if you're doing your first geothermal drilling, or all sorts of testing out new technology funding, all the way through really advanced scale deployment, and then loans for projects that are ready to really deploy at scale. So there's an entire suite of tools for every size of technology available to both producers and consumers alike. And so happy to share some of those resources. But
yeah, that would be great to share them. And with the caveat that with the new administration, some of these things are sort of on pause while they review policies and how they want to move forward. But there is certainly a lot out there for consumption as far as incentives for clean energy things. JF, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I couldn't comment on US mechanisms. I would say that what probably is missing often in places like here in mainland Europe, perhaps, is mechanisms that help consumers have access to the finance that they would need. Because even if you have a subsidy, for instance, in the UK, there's a subsidy on heat pumps to upgrade houses, but it still costs a lot to renovate the house. So it might be helpful to instead have a type of loan that allows to do this. And the same for cars. I think the same for different types of consumer-oriented things that people could do. I think the UK has been more successful at sort of industrial level power sector. That's worked really well, but for consumers, it kind of has yet to happen.
It's interesting. Do either of you have any advice for communicating about the value of investments and adaptation measures in avoiding future costs? We've talked a lot about this. There has been a lot of conversation about how we are already experiencing floods and other extremes, and how spending now can avoid future costs. But there does seem to be just a stagnation in terms of progress on the policy side. So I think what the questioner is asking is, how do we tell that story in a way that resonates with policymakers on adaptation?
Well, I can have a go. I'd say it's a bit like if you entered a casino, but all the machines were a bit rigged and they were increasingly riskier. And the more you played, the riskier the game got, and you were bound to lose one day, all your fortune. I would say that's the kind of analogy. And so your adaptation investment is getting you out of the casino and trying to get you on a different path where you're not going to be headed in that way. So climate impacts are just intensifying. So the losses are not just increasing so gradually, they're becoming exponentially larger. So eventually it becomes so large an expense that nobody can get through this without outright default in terms of a state or in terms of a company. And well, you can see it in the US with the fires. I think it's becoming so large that it's even hard to imagine the scale of the loss that's been made there. So, but it happens everywhere in the world. So that I think maybe this casino analogy where things getting worse and worse is, I don't know if it's good, but that's how I see it.
House always wins.
Yeah, and I'll just hop in quickly. I think when you think about the shape of physical climate hazards, you can see them playing out in really a local, state, and regional level at first. And so that will probably be where most climate adaptation happens, in a really local, specific level that's tailored to your specific community. And there are a lot of great groups working on resilience and adaptation at scale. with local communities and working on policy. And just one that comes to mind is the American Flood Coalition in the US, working with states on really thoughtful adaptation and resilience solutions. And so there are groups like that that I would suggest looking to for how they're working hand in hand with communities and policy makers at every level, but particularly at the state level, for how to address these challenges with communities.
That's a good point, to sort of tell that story through state and local examples, I think is always helpful, particularly when you're talking about communicating messages to members of Congress who are concerned about their districts and their constituencies. We have a question about carbon capture and storage. Could you think of carbon capture and storage as a measure, both on the mitigation and adaptation sides? Is there a different way to think about these investments and associated risks for this kind of technology? And is the financing and investment for carbon capture and storage approached differently than other tools?
Right, happy to comment on that. So I think in the climate strategy, you bet on our horses. You don't just bet on one. And so it's important to invest a bit in all the options we've got in case one of them turns out to be very good. And that's how a venture capitalist also works. But the carbon capture and storage, the one thing we begin to know about this is it doesn't scale all that well. It works. We've been using this to push oil out of the ground when there's a decline in oil production. We use carbon dioxide to push oil out. So we already know how to do this, except that it's costly. It's comes in the equation where you're not really sure to finance it. And the problem is that the scale doesn't make the cost come down all that much. And so if you're going to compare that with solar, the problem is that solar's got a 30% learning rate. So obviously solar always looks like a better investment than carbon capture. So carbon capture then becomes mostly a kind of academic discussion where we talk a lot about it. There's a few demonstration projects, but it never seems to come to reality. And so I don't know for how much longer we're going to sort of keep betting on that horse. I'm not saying it's going to lose, but I'm starting to be a little bit less enthusiastic about carbon capture and storage, because I get the impression we might well find other ways to do this. There's other ways to capture carbon as well, like enhanced weathering that is a completely different system, but could work. Potentially direct air capture can also scale a bit more, but even then, so certainly using negative emissions with those technologies in order to justify using more fossil fuels, that's a losing game, right? That's really not going to work. So my guess is it's more productive to put more money on renewables because they just scale better and they're a better business overall.
I'm enjoying all of your gambling analogies and vocabulary, JF. Thank you. Justina, do you want to weigh in on carbon capture?
Sure. Just very quickly, I think perhaps some of the intent of the question was presuming that carbon capture is usually identified as a mitigation technology. And so can it actually be tagged as an adaptation technology? And I would just note that there's probably a pretty big Venn diagram overlap in adaptation and mitigation technologies. So think of grid enhancements that you'd want for a resilience perspective, but also grid enhancements that you would want for general transmission and distribution enhancements across the country, which probably could be tagged as both adaptation and mitigation. And so wouldn't get too twisted on the definitions there, so much so as what does it take to meet the needs of those communities and the communities at scale.
Thank you both for that. One last question before we wrap up. What is the thing that both of you would like our audience to take away from today's conversation? Justina, let's start with you.
Sure. Very simply that we are in a place of incredible clean energy, productivity, and dominance in the US. And there's such productivity that is underway across 35 plus clean energy sectors. And they're all looking up, and the future is ours to really define in this moment. And I think there's a lot of capacity for folks at the state, local, public, and particularly private sector to define what comes next.
Thank you. JF?
Yeah, well, I'd say the climate discussion used to be a lot about, is it going to be expensive? And it's changing drastically now, and it's much more about, can we finance it? And financing is then a question about the capacity of financial institutions to shoulder that. In effect, it's not really an expensive thing anymore because a lot of the technologies are now good return. They're really profitable, but nonetheless is capital intensive in that it requires a lot of upfront investment, and then it puts strain on financial institutions to produce all of that finance. So what we need to start to think about really is much more about financial risk and how to manage that than is it going to be expensive. I think it's actually going to be productive for the economy. It's going to accelerate economic growth, but we need to be able to manage that risk.
Yeah, well said. Well, thank you so much to both of you. Thank you for the discussion, the great insights and your expertise. It's been a pleasure talking with you both. And I'm going to turn it back over to Laura.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly, for moderating this fantastic conversation. And JF and Justina, thank you both for your really insightful contributions. And a thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you so much for your interest and your excellent questions. The conversation was recorded and will be available to view on the same webpage immediately after we end. If you'd like to share any feedback on today's event or ideas for future events, please take our survey. If you haven't already, please register for our climate newsletter or follow us on social media by searching NASEM Climate to get updates on all things climate at the academies. For our February climate conversation, we'll be unpacking the range of factors that are increasing urban wildfire risk and explore practical actions that homeowners, communities, and different levels of government can take to be more resilient in the face of future fires. The registration page will be up soon, so be sure to subscribe to our newsletter to get updates. Finally, a huge thank you to my National Academies colleague, Brent Hurd, from the Board on Energy and Environmental Systems for helping put this whole thing together. I also really want to thank the staff who supported today's event behind the scenes. Thank you all again for joining, and stay warm, and we'll see you in February.